And I'm going to turn it over to Gary, who's going to enlighten us on how we can have our own pursuit of genealogy.
Thank you, Elisa. Does anybody need to take a break, stretch, move around? That was a great presentation. And I've spent probably, I'm going to guess, maybe the last 20 years or so working on my family genealogy. Fortunately, I have a spouse who's also interested in the same thing. And we've made many trips together, and we've had many moments. We have never gone to Europe like Lisa Kudrow did, but we've traveled all over the United States and met a number of relatives and recorded information, shared pictures, shared stories. But for most of us, I'm going to guess, we don't have NBC or we don't have Bill Kaufman to make a presentation like you saw today. So it's going to take some time and research and phone calls and emails and time in the library. And we really live in a really neat time for Jewish genealogy because there's so many ways that you can connect with people. As you saw, there's Ancestry.com. I often use another website called JewishGen.com, which I think is better than Ancestry, actually. And there's so much information available that you also have to be very, very cautious of what you're looking at and take time to verify what you're seeing. Even you might have interviewed a grandfather or an old relative, and they told you a story, and you wrote it down, and you pass it on to others. But just because they said it doesn't mean it's true. And I'm going to cover some of that. Getting it right is really, really, really important. How many people here do any genealogy work right now? Okay, good. So a bunch of people do. How many people know who their great-grandparents are? Okay, and how many people know their great-great-grandparents? All right, very good. Anybody know triple great-grandparents? Okay, and Paula, what do you know anything about them other than their name?
I do have some information. Actually, I did not take credit. My first cousin on my mother's side.
Oh, did some research.
Has done a lot of research.
Because what happens, sometimes the further back you go, all you have is a name. You don't really know anything about that person. And one of the things that we try to do is tell the stories about what's going on. And in Judaism in particular, if you read Torah, have ever heard Torah read, it's full of genealogy. I mean, all over the place. We're talking about this person begat this person, begat that person. So we know a lot about our ancestors, who they were. We know some of the stories. Hi, Monroe. And but yet we really don't know a lot about our great-great and great-great-great-grandparents, maybe who came from Europe. And I try to extend genealogy, not just looking back, but also looking forward. Because when I pass on, I hope that my grandchildren and the grandchildren of my grandchildren know a lot more about me than I do about my ancestors. I hope they have photographs, videos, information, some stories, the things that I did in my life, the things that I was interested in. So I want you to think of genealogy not just about yesterday and just looking up your roots, but also about connecting with your relatives who exist right now, finding out who's having a baby, who's getting married, where they work, what they're doing in their lives, some of their accomplishments, some of the newspaper stories. So I try to do a lot of that business too. So I'm going to take you through a presentation. I'd like people to ask questions. Maybe we can get through the presentation first, and then we'll field questions so things can move along. Right here, if you're curious, this is a picture of some of my ancestors. Right here is my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, and that would be my great-great-grandmother sitting in the middle there. And these are his three brothers. This was taken in Russia in 1890. This is the Kodner family and my dad's grandparents, so it'd be my great-grandparents. Kodner genealogy is easy to do. Number one, Kodner is a pretty common name. Not a common name, I'm sorry. And both my grandparents were Kodners before birth, and both my great-grandparents were Kodners before birth. So we got Kodners marrying Kodners, and it's really easy to find them all because they're all related to each other. As I said before, Jews have been tracking their ancestors for thousands of generations. I think it's part of what makes us Jews. I think that the fact that we do, among many people, the Romans, the Egyptians, even though everybody has tried to wipe us out, we're still here, and we still know who our ancestors are, and we still have our traditions. The Torah, as I mentioned, is full of genealogy. We still honor our ancestors every year with our yard sites. And where we came from influences our identity, our customs. It influences our religious beliefs, our behavior, our language, the talents, and even the occupations that Jews have had over the years are all influenced by our ancestors. So if you're going to get started, if you're a beginner, and that's what I'm trying to gear this talk today for as beginners, and hopefully we'll have more talks and more times to meet and talk about genealogy. But today I want to kind of gear it down to somebody who doesn't know how to get started on doing this. The first thing you need to do is start with what you know. And everybody probably knows who their parents and grandparents are. And then you could work back to your great-grandparents, and then your great-great-grandparents, and great-great-great-grandparents if you can go that far. Paula's been fortunate to have that information. That's amazing when you know that kind of stuff. And you have to do that by interviewing the oldest members in the family first. Not because that's the most important, but because the oldest members won't be around us forever. They'll be leaving us first. So you definitely want to have those interviews. And if you have any multimedia capability at all, if you have a recorder or a camera, you'll want to really record that because it's precious. Once they leave us, they're gone. You can never interview them again. So one of my quests is to perpetuate the family memory. And genealogy should be more than just the names and the dates. We should record all of the stories, the letters that people wrote. Those are so valuable to have. Photos. I've collected probably around 5,000 or 10,000 photos. I created a whole closet in my house full of albums and photos that I've collected. Not just photos from my own genealogy, but when I travel, I always try to look up in the phone book or check out people on the internet who are related to me, who live in those cities. I get together with them. I bring a scanner with me, and I scan their photos in so I have them. But it just can't be a collection of old information. It has to be an ongoing quest for new information as well, stuff that's happening today. Most important, it's about getting it right, recording it so it can be shared accurately to current and future generations. You know, Ancestry.com is wonderful because it's a place to connect, it's a place to get information and get yourself started. But just because somebody put it on the internet doesn't mean it's correct. Keep that in mind. People will put wrong information on there. Although they'll put information that they think is right, but it's never been verified. They've never gotten into the library. They've never found the documents to support what they believe in some of those things that they're making. And I've corrected a lot of things for people over the years. So you start with yourself. Everybody knows who their self. They know their immediate family. They know their brothers and sisters and their children and their grandchildren. You'll want to record all that information too. And again, you'll obviously start with their date of birth and where they were born, basic information. But again, try to work out into something about that person, something that they're interested in or something that they accomplished in their life, because somebody 100 years from now will be very interested in that. And obviously, you want to work up the family tree to your parents and great-grandparents. You want to stay organized from the beginning. No matter how big you make this project, you might just want to just do one immediate family or one branch of the family, but you need to stay organized. Keep files and folders. I do it both ways. I have an internet program that I keep track of all my information, but I also have a file drawer full of paper. I have a paper copy of all the stuff that I've researched. I hope someday we don't have to keep both, but right now I just don't know what happens to digital information, if it'll ever get lost or if my computer will ever break down or whatever. I like to have both. And it's a lot about interviews and research, and we're going to talk about that. So what you'll need to get started is you'll need some notebooks, you'll need folders, envelopes, and a file box, a place to keep it. And I like to keep mine in a portable file box. Why a portable file box? Because a big file cabinet I can't carry out of my house should there be a flood or a fire. Where a plastic bin, I can carry that out if I want. And to me, that's more important than my couch or my stereo or my Macintosh. I will take that first. It's really helpful to have a camera, a tape recorder, or a computer, or a smartphone, or all of those devices, because all those devices can gather information. If you go to any kind of family event or a simcha, a wedding or a party, a bar mitzvah, those are wonderful places to collect information. And people want to tell their stories. And it's impossible to write it all down or remember it all. Also, you want to have access to libraries, the internet, research institution, and cemeteries. All these things are great places to find information about your family. And if your family's not from St. Louis, you need to look in institutions and libraries and cemeteries that are in the cities where you know your families are from. Pedigree charts are important, and we're going to talk about how you do those, and family group sheets to collect and record the information. Now, on the table, I handed out some pages that contain some of the basic places where you can find all this stuff. And also on BSKI's website, we've posted even more PDFs, which have all kinds of really nice resources for collecting this kind of data. There's genealogy software. I recommend you use genealogy software. These are some of the main ones that are available that people use on a regular basis. I use Reunion because I'm a Mac user, but all of these can do a good job. And this is where you want to keep your information. There's a word down here called GEDCOM. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, GEDCOM is a common computer language that all of these programs speak. So, for example, if you find a relative in another place in another city working on their computer, compiling their family history, you could actually share GEDCOMs with them, or you could post them on JewishGen and download them from the internet, and you could actually take their information into your computer or vice versa. And I always try to caution people that whenever you share information, you should definitely use filters. All these programs have filters to filter out sensitive information about people who are alive. Because there are identity thieves and frauds all over the internet and all over our society, it's an unfortunate part of life there are, you'll want to protect somebody in your family who is still alive. You want to be sharing their birthday and a lot of personal information about them. So all these programs have filters to filter that out. This is just a quick slide of what my genealogy software looks like. And this is my home page. That's me on the left and Peggy on the right. And if you just start clicking up, you could keep going up through the tree, or you could click sideways and go through it. We probably have about 3,000 people now in our database. And that might seem like a lot. Monroe, how many do you have in your database?
4,300.
Yeah. So it shows you can, and there are people who only have 50 people in their database. All is okay. This is a scalable hobby or endeavor. What's most important, though, is that in this area here, you keep adding to the database. You keep adding information. And here are my two children down here, and if you click on them, you can open up their files and learn about their lives, too. Some very, very smart people, Gary Mokotov and Randy Deitch, created a phonetic algorithm. And the best way to explain this is the Deitch-Mokotov Soundex system is a way that libraries use to track Jewish names and places. Because what you'll find out is because of the many languages that Jews have spoke, from Yiddish to Polish to Russian and who knows what else, what other countries we've been in, that names constantly change in their form and in their spelling. And even though we're in the 21st century really hung up on correct spellings, my name has to be spelled such and such a way, in the 19th century that wasn't so. You could find people in the same family spell their name differently, their surname differently. So when you're searching, it makes it tough. If you're searching for a particular name, this system, this Deitch-Mokotov Soundex system, enables you to look at all of the possibilities of how that name could have been spelled. You need to document your research. You need to take good notes. And really important that a lot of people fail to do is you need to identify your sources, because that's what makes your research more authentic than the next guy's research. Because you're going to run into people who maybe are researching the same family where you guys crossed over in the same family, and they say it happened this way and you say it happened this way. But if you have the sources, if you showed that you have the ship manifest, or if you have that birth certificate, as I said before, a genealogy program is recommended. They're not expensive. It's the best way to keep track of your research, and it's the best way to make your research portable. If you don't want to slug around a computer, they also make these for smartphones. There's an app for this Jewish genealogy, so I've got my entire database right here in my telephone. So if I'm visiting somebody in another city or somebody says they think they might be related to me, I could instantly bring up my data right here on my phone. And it's really, really helpful. In fact, I was in the hospital last week visiting a relative, and we were talking about the family, and they said, wasn't so-and-so's names, and I whipped this thing out, I look it up, no, their name was, this. And then it brings back stories about that person. And I could record that, this also is a recording device, and it takes pictures also. So right away, I'm adding to my information in my database. So make those recordings and those of interviews. Check the information if it's true, and can you verify that information with more than one source? Because one of the things you're also going to find out is you'll find a source. I'll find a death certificate, and it says the person's name was such and such, and this is their parents' names, and this is where they're from. And then I'll look at a naturalization document. It says something completely different for the same person. So which one's the better source? I would say the naturalization document is better than the death certificate, because the death certificate was done after the person was deceased, probably done by a witness who really wasn't sure. And the same with census records. I see census records, 1920 census it says this, and then the 1930 census it says something else. Well, somebody comes to the door, they're talking to somebody maybe who speaks Yiddish, they're recording it the way they think it was. Nobody ever tries to check or get it right, they just write it down. So you actually have to think about what kind of document am I looking at, and sometimes it takes 1, 2, 3, even 4 documents to really verify what the true age of that person was, or where they're really from, or what their parents' name was. Watch for the name changes and the spelling variants. They are all over the board. You will see your name spelled in every which way, and I know that the tendency is to think, they couldn't be related to me. That's not the way my family spelled it. Wrong. They will spell it differently, and even today, even in this world right now, I've been to California and met family members who spell their name differently, but they are definitely related. Also, good archival practices are important. When you keep a lot of documents, you got to keep them out of the light. No tape, no acid papers. People like to tape things in books, and they like to put them with newspapers, which are full of acid. You got to keep photo documents out of the light, separated by plastic sleeves so they don't stick together. They will over time. Everything depreciates over time. And put them in really nice covered binders so they're kept together and they're kept from, and by all means keep organized. Because the more you get, the more complicated this hobby becomes. You just lose track. You got so many families you're chasing. I think the keeper of the family information is a big responsibility. Not everybody's up to it, not everybody cares, and not everybody wants to do it. But I take it on very seriously, and so much so, as I said before, if I get online and find somebody else who's also researching my family from another direction or another angle, and they've got wrong information, I try to correct it. I try to contact that person and say, no, that's not right, and I give them the very reasons why I think that they've got some information that's wrong. And sharing inaccurate information will be passed on, and it will be repeated. It will be repeated for generations, and it's very hard to correct. These are some common myths about genealogy that we constantly hear. The first one is a big one. Our name was changed at Ellis Island. There were no name changes at Ellis Island at all, 0. That's a big myth. I was watching The Godfather Part 2 on TV yesterday, and the young Vito Corleone, he must be about 7 or 8 years old, comes to Ellis Island, and he's standing before an official, and the official looks at him and looks where he's from, and he asks the kid his name, and his kid gives him the name, and he says, no, your name will be Vito Corleone because that's where you're from. That just didn't happen. That's a myth. The ship manifests from Ellis Island were filled out in Europe. They were filled out at the port at which the person left from. And when they arrived at Ellis Island, the main function of Ellis Island was processing people to see if they were healthy enough to enter into the United States. Any name changes, you had to go before a judge or through your naturalization process, then you could change your name. But no names were changed at Ellis Island. It's spelled differently, they can't be related. Well, as I mentioned before, yeah, they can be. The spellings were arbitrary, in my opinion, and often got wrong. Even on those ship manifests, the names were wrong. Another big myth, all the records were burned or destroyed. I hear that so often. That's not always the case. Many records exist, even records in Europe. As you saw in Lisa Kudrow's piece, she went to Poland and found records. And many of those records are still being discovered. My wife participates in a very large JRI Poland project where they are taking Jewish Polish records. Many of these have been microfilmed by the Mormons. The Mormons are avid genealogists. They keep track of not just themselves, but they keep track of everybody else. And she actually took a class, learned Polish, so she could read the microfilm and transcribe it into English so it can be posted on the internet. And this is a very long, arduous process, and it's still going on as we speak today. So even though you might not have found that record 5 years ago, it doesn't mean that you might not find it in the future or find it today. Those records are still being discovered and still being recorded by all kinds of people. My bubby said, my cousin told me, those are great stories and they're great places to start, but again, you can't trust what your bubby said. Peggy's grandfather, who lived till 99 years old, we made lots of recordings. We had lots of sittings with him where we talked about genealogy. He told us about coming to America as a child. He told us about coming to Ellis Island and how wonderful that was. And for some reason, Peggy and I could never find a Ellis Island manifest with his name on it. We even bought a plaque at Ellis Island, with his name on it, honoring him coming to the United States. Well, finally we discovered that he had a brother who he had a falling out with and didn't speak to for the rest of his life. We found his family in California, and so we started following his brother's records. And sure enough, we found him coming into a port of Philadelphia on a ship manifest, and there was Peggy's grandfather's name. So Grandpa, he liked the story and he told it to a lot of people, but it's just not true. It says on a gravestone or a death certificate must be correct. Again, as I told you, gravestones and death certificates are only as good as the person who is the witness at the time and telling the funeral home the information. I found it online, it must be true. Again, I've covered that. Don't believe it just because it's online. And I'm not saying don't work online, because there's treasures online. There's great clues and there's great hordes of information now online. But take the time to look it up and find out if that person or if that document really does match up and support that information. So here's some I put together what I consider a hierarchy of information. Primary information was recorded at the time of the event and submitted by an eyewitness or a knowledgeable person. So obviously somebody recording a birth record of your grandfather, that's a pretty reliable thing. They were actually there at the time of the birth, and it was recorded. And as I said before, the birth date of that same person on their death certificate, not so reliable, not so primary. Secondary information is derived from hearsay or long after the events occurred. Original records are very important. And derivative records. Derivative records provide information that has been collected, repeated, reproduced, transmitted, or copied from a previous source. So that's really what you're going to end up creating, is this derivative record. So this derivative record that you're creating that is being reproduced or transcribed or copied or put into some form for some future generation to see needs to also include some of these primary sources. I put together a list of questions if people want to use it as a way to start interviewing people, or you can make up your own list of questions. You're going to run into people who are going to be willing and excited that you're contacting them, and believe it or not, you're going to run into people who won't even want to talk to you. As I told you the story about Peggy's grandfather, who had a falling out, some kind of business or financial deal that went wrong, and they stopped talking to each other sometime in the 1930s or 40s, never spoke to each other again. When Peggy and I encountered the descendants of the brother in California, once they heard that story, they didn't want to talk to us anymore. So I suggest that you compose a form letter so you're not nervous or excited when you meet somebody who's related to you, and you don't forget, too, because once you leave them, you go, oh, I wish I would have asked them that. So you contact people through snail mail letter writing. Some people still do that. Or email, I find the most efficient, because email, you have an instant record of what somebody sent back to you, and it's easier to document. Again, don't forget to interview the oldest people first. Make audio-video recordings. And be sensitive to people's skepticism and fears, because they're real. People enjoy their privacy, especially in this time where so many people are rip-off artists. So approach people with sensitivity and let them know who you are and let them know your intentions and let them know that you have every interest in protecting their privacy. Now, I also mentioned this should not just be a search for the past, to look into history. I think that you should be constantly on the watch for current information because it's all around us. Particularly, we live in a time where information is so easily gathered because most of us, anyway, have a computer in their house, access to the internet, access to newspapers, magazines, libraries. So look for online stories and biographies. When you go to a family party at an event, use that as an opportunity to interview people and ask questions, share information. I use Google search, as most people do. How many of you use Google Alerts? Google Alerts is a really cool thing. I set up Google Alerts, for example, if I set up a Google Alert for the name Codner, anytime, anywhere in this universe that Google recognizes a Codner coming up on the internet for anything, for something that they've done, or for a project they've been involved in, or a news story, or a paper they wrote, I get an alert. And I can click on that alert, and it takes me immediately to that spot. And you should, I mean, it's just amazing how much genealogy information I collect just using that technique. And it all comes to me. I don't have to go look for it. The Jewish Light is now available online as well, and they're slowly but surely archiving it all. Other Jewish newspapers from the past. I don't know how many of you have been to the Missouri Historical Society Research Library. It's the old United Hebrew on Skinker. They have copies of Jewish newspapers going way, way back to the beginning of the century. And lots of neat stories in there. They also have original volumes of, how should I call them? They kind of were like phone books. In the earlier days of city directories, they were called. Yeah, and it's really interesting what you could find in a city directory. They're fascinating to me. You could find out where people live, what kind of business they had in these city directories, and they're really wearing out, but they're still available. Funerals and shiva houses are great places for Jewish genealogy. I sit there at a funeral sometimes and listen to the speeches given, and I'll go up afterwards and ask the person if they have a copy of it, and oftentimes they did, because nowadays people type things into their computer and they'll be willing to share it with you, and you get an instantaneous dialogue of somebody's life. That's really, really important to have that you couldn't have gotten any other way. And like I say, when I travel, I take the time to find out if there are relatives in the city that I'm traveling to, and we reach out to them before we leave, and most of the time, they're willing to meet with us. And again, it's a treasure trove of information and an opportunity to pick up stories and photographs. Where to look? Synagogues, believe it or not, are a good place to look. The synagogue records here, the yort sites, are an important place to look. The plaques, the histories, even old Chumashim and Sidurim, sometimes people, particularly in the previous century, would write down their family genealogy in the edges and in the fronts and backs of these books. And if you're lucky enough to have any of that passed on in your family, they're a good place to find things. Collect old photos and make sure you identify and label those photos as much as possible. We have a bunch of mystery photos that we've collected, and we have no idea who the people are in them, but we know the relatives because we collected them from relatives. We'll post them online. And somebody happens upon them, they'll email me or call me and go, I recognize the person in that photo. That's my grandmother, and then boom. Cemetery records, headstones, websites, these are all good places to search. Must places to look. You have to look at public records and archives. They're available, and what's neat about these public records and archives, they have people there who will help you. You don't have to be a genius researcher. If you walk into any of these places, they will help you and show you how to find what you're looking for. All the historical societies and cities are wonderful places to look. The Mormons, believe it or not, the LDS records, they're huge. Not all of us could go to Salt Lake City, but your library right here in St. Louis will check out any document you want or any microfilm you want and bring it to St. Louis for you to look at it right here in our library. So the public libraries, both city and county, are good to look at. Municipal governments have archives and records. Some of them charge a fee to get a record, some don't. Definitely worth doing. And when you get a record, make copies. So the internet and libraries are the places to look. And this is just a long list, and I'll let you take a look at it, of some of the things that I try to keep on a particular family or person that I'm researching. A lot of people forget some things like Canadian passenger lists. Everybody thinks they came through Ellis Island. Not everybody did. Some Jews were denied and came through Canada. Some came through Texas, believe it or not. Some went to China for a while and then came here. Some went to Israel. So you really have to look in a lot of different places. Not everybody came to Ellis Island. Marriage certificates and ketubas, all these are really, really neat places to look. This is what a ship manifest looks like. This particular ship manifest was the SS Aquitania, which sailed from Cherbourg, France to New York, came into Ellis Island. This is my family, my ancestors. And when you look at these things, it can be complicated because for whatever reason, my grandfather, Paul Codner, as I knew him, he's recorded on this document as Finney Codner. Again, I never found a document where his name was Finney. How did they get Finney Codner? Well, I'm not really sure, but there's some clues. His real name in Europe was Pinchas. And Pinchas could be construed maybe as Phineas, which could be construed as Finney, not really sure. But those are the kinds of mysteries that you have to look at when you're looking at names. Don't just assume because the name was wrong here that that's not my grandfather, that's not the person. You start to look at the other people traveling in his group. A lot of people may know Sylvia Rothberg because she was a member here. She appears on this manifest as Sherva. I guess Sherva's close to Sylvia, I don't know. She was a baby when she arrived at Ellis Island in August of 1922. And the old family pictures also can be confusing and can tell different stories. This person right here down on the left is my grandfather. That's Joseph Fadem and his family. The person in the middle, most people would identify as a daughter or a girl, right? That's a boy. That is Ted Fadem in the center there. So again, sometimes pictures don't take them for their face value. For whatever reason, they would put dresses on young boys in those days. Why, I don't know. And also, don't think that this is the way these people dressed. I guarantee you they were dressed up because this was a portrait, and people didn't have their own cameras in those days. The only time you were ever photographed is if you went to a photo studio like this and took a picture. This is that picture that I was showing you of the Fadem family. And what a wonderful picture. And this picture has an interesting story because this is my great-grandfather here. And when I first started out with genealogy, everybody said you can't go any further than him in the Fadem family because he was orphaned. Either his parents were killed in a pogrom or maybe his mother died in childbirth or whatever. But he was an orphan, so you can't go any further than that. This was taken in St. Louis about 1910. So that bothered me that I couldn't go any further, but I said, so the people, I told you I took that trip to Tulsa where I found this photograph. They said, well, who is he raised by? And they said he was raised by his father's brother, who was Zangwill Fadem. I said, well, who's this Zangwill Fadem? No one ever mentioned that name to me before. And they said, well, there he is, right in the middle of the picture. He is the big patriarch of the family. He's the one who got everybody to come to America. And I said, well, where do I find Zangwill Fadem? So I started looking for him and looking for him and looking through records. And believe it or not, I found Zangwill Fadem's yurt site right here at BSKI. And then, I'm looking all over the world for this guy, and he's right here in this congregation, which was kind of an exciting find. And once I found his yurt site at BSKI, it had the name of his father, which would be my great-great-great-grandfather, which is really, fun to find out. And that way I was able to continue finding on the rest of the family. So when you hit those roadblocks, you got to keep on going. Also, if you have a genealogy program, it's easy to create family trees and reports. And I know you can't read the names, but that's not important here. What I want to show you is if you go to a family event, if you're going to be traveling to a wedding in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Los Angeles, California, wherever you're going, print one of these out and take it with you. You would be surprised how many people have either corrected a name, filled in extra information for me, added a whole branch to the family that I didn't even know, because you could see it all in front of you and it's easy to find. Another thing I do is I go through the cemeteries and I photograph all of the headstones. This is really important to do because cemeteries are crazy places. They're not like file cabinets where they're organized by A, B, C, D. Your family is spread out all over the whole place sometimes, and it's tough to find things. So I like to photograph them so if I want to refer to that information. And again, when you look over here, and in this case it helps to know some Hebrew, you could figure out who this person was. And in this was really kind of a nice grave because this one actually had a picture of the person. Not many of them have pictures, but they did do that somewhere. Now, the other thing about cemeteries is I try to record the locations. So when I do find a grave, I actually make myself a chart where I record the exact location of that grave. And I've even created maps too, which I've shared with you guys, and those can be found online as well. Historic maps are really important because when you're doing Jewish genealogy in Europe, the maps today don't tell the story. Because of war, because of the Holocaust, and because of a whole lot of other political factors, these borders changed so many times in the life of your family living there that it gets crazy. What we do know is there was an area in Eastern Europe called the Pale of Settlement where Jews were allowed to settle for a pretty long period of time. There's several hundred years where Jews settled there. And if you look at historic maps, they more accurately have the location or the name or the province that your family came from. They called them gubernias in Europe. So this is some of the gubernias. And again, some of them are Russia, some of them are Austria, some of them are Poland, and some of them switched because this border between Russia and Poland was constantly in a state of flux. It moved around a lot. And Jews were a little bit different than the rest of the population. They didn't consider themselves Poles or Russians. They considered themselves Jews. This is a map that I designed of Chesed Shalemeth, because I didn't like their maps. I didn't think they were accurate enough, and I liked one that I could read better. Genealogy is a scalable project. A lot of people think it's too big, it's too massive. It can be whatever you want it to be. It could be a research project, it could be a hobby, it could just be one story of your life. That could be a genealogical project. It could be a complete history, where you also give histories of the places your ancestors came from. It could become an archive for others who are doing research on your family in the now and in the future. It could also be a mystery. I have a lot of mysteries in my family and mysteries that I've solved, and it's really exciting when you reach the point where you've solved a mystery for years, like I told you about the Zangwill Fatum story. It's very exciting when you can solve a mystery. And it could be a puzzle, and it could also be an obsession. Okay, I want to give some time because I know people have questions. And again, what I hope we can do, and this is something that Marvin and I and Elisa talked about, that if this is something that people are really interested in doing, we could have subsequent sessions. We could maybe even form a group of people that might want to meet at a library and do some research there where you could actually go one-on-one with someone who knows how to show you how to walk through this stuff and start discovering things.
Let's give Gary a big, big thank you. Wonderful information. And if you didn't pick up the handouts that Gary put out there, grab them. They've got wonderful resources. Do check BSKI's website. I think if you just follow the link about today's presentation, you'll get links to the other PDFs he's shared. He's got fabulous resources. He's done all the hard work, and take a look at those.